Stop thinking of money as paper. Start thinking of it as a license for power. In 1944, while the world burned, a secluded hotel became the stage for a silent coup. Not with soldiers, but with signatures. 44 nations, desperate for peace, signed a document that didn't just create a new system. It installed a global financial monarchy. They agreed to hand the keys of the world's economy to a single country, granting it a privilege so profound, so exploitative, that its architects knew it couldn't last. This is the story of the trap we still live in. This is the Bretton Woods betrayal. The year is 1944. World War II rages, but in the boardrooms of the Allies, the next war, the economic war, has already begun. The old world's financial system lay in ruins. The classical gold standard had died in the trauma of the Great Depression in the 1930s, giving way to a chaotic, beggar-thy-neighbor era of competitive currency devaluations and trade blocs. Nations, drowning in unemployment, tried to export their despair by making their currencies cheaper, triggering retaliatory tariffs that strangled global commerce. This economic anarchy was rightly seen as a root cause of the military conflict now engulfing the globe. Into this vacuum of fear and instability stepped two rival visions. From a bankrupt Great Britain came John Maynard Keynes, the celebrated intellectual father of modern macroeconomics. From the ascendant United States came Harry Dexter White, a shrewd, determined, and pragmatic U.S. Treasury official. Their mandated task at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, was identical: to design a post-war monetary system that would guarantee stability, facilitate reconstruction, and prevent future depressions and wars by binding economies together. But their proposed blueprints were philosophical opposites. Keynes, representing an empire financially exhausted by war, proposed a system of radical international equity. His plan centered on a synthetic international currency called the Bancor. All trade would be cleared through a central international clearing union. The revolutionary, and for the Americans, unacceptable, core of his design was its symmetry. It would automatically penalize both chronic trade surplus and deficit nations, forcing economic adjustment on all sides. It was a system designed to prevent any single country from accumulating overwhelming financial dominance. Harry Dexter White's plan was structurally simpler but politically monumental. It called for all world currencies to peg their values not to gold directly, but to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar alone would maintain a fixed convertibility to gold at $35 an ounce. In effect, the dollar would become as good as gold, while gold itself would recede into the background, physically lodged in American vaults. This design didn't just give America a seat at the table. It made America the banker, the rule-maker, and the ultimate arbiter of the entire global financial system. The stage was set for a diplomatic confrontation where one side held all the cards, all the gold, and all the leverage. The setting, the Mount Washington Hotel, was a palace of Gilded Age grandeur isolated in the New Hampshire wilderness. This isolation was strategic. Delegates from 44 nations were removed from the pressures of their capitals, immersed in an atmosphere where the only focus was the dense, technical negotiation ahead. For 3 weeks in July, the hotel's halls buzzed with a cacophony of languages, heated debates in committee rooms, and desperate lobbying in corridors. The power dynamic in the room was palpable and tilted decisively. The United States delegation, led by White, operated from a position of unassailable strength. America held over 70% of the world's official monetary gold reserves. Its industrial base was not only intact but booming, untouched by the devastation that had ravaged Europe and Asia. It was the world's undeniable creditor. In contrast, John Maynard Keynes, for all his intellectual prestige, represented a British empire that was functionally bankrupt, surviving on American lend-lease aid that could be, and would be, terminated to force compliance. White exploited this leverage with clinical precision. The conference machinery itself was engineered for American control. Key committees were chaired by Americans. The drafting of documents was overseen by White's team. When Keynes fought for the expansive, automatic drawing rights of his international clearing union, White systematically diluted the proposal. He capped the size of the fund, making it insufficient for true global reconstruction without further American loans. He ensured voting power in the new International Monetary Fund, IMF, would be based on financial contribution, a quota system that guaranteed the U.S. a de facto veto. Keynes, battling ill health and the grim reality of his nation's dependence, fought a brilliant but losing rearguard action. He famously clashed with White, accusing the American of understanding the words but not the music of international finance. The real struggle was between a vision of a collaborative multilateral system and the reality of American unilateral power. The final days were a marathon of exhaustion. Delegates, sweltering in the summer heat, argued over gold parities and exchange margins late into the night. The final act was not a consensus, but a ratification of American terms. On July 22, 1944, the agreements were signed. The Bretton Woods system was born, not from equitable partnership, but from the explicit and undeniable supremacy of the last economic superpower standing. The signed Bretton Woods agreements created two institutions, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, World Bank. Their stated missions were noble, to provide stability and fund rebuilding. But the real, revolutionary mechanism was the exchange rate system itself. All member nations agreed to peg their currencies to the U.S. dollar within a 1% band. The U.S., in turn, pledged to redeem those dollars for gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce for foreign governments and central banks. This created a gold exchange standard, but with a critical hierarchy. The dollar was enthroned as the central reserve asset, the primary medium for international trade, and the vehicle currency for all interventions. Imagine the global economy as a solar system. Every other currency orbited the dollar, and the dollar alone had a fixed, official link to the sun, gold. This gave the system its initial credibility. Countries accumulated dollars as reserves, which were as good as gold, because they were convertible. For war-ravaged nations, this provided the stability to rebuild trade patterns. For the United States, it conferred the exorbitant privilege later identified by French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. This privilege had three immediate, enormous benefits. First, seigniorage. America could purchase foreign goods, assets, and resources simply by printing dollars, which the world needed for its reserves. Second, financing flexibility. The U.S. could run large trade deficits, importing more than it exported, because the outflow of dollars was not a crisis but a service, supplying the world with its needed liquidity. Third, financial dominance. Global trade in commodities like oil, wheat, and metals would increasingly be priced and settled in dollars, forcing all nations to hold dollar balances and deepening American financial market dominance. The system, therefore, was not a neutral technical framework. It was a hierarchy institutionalizing American financial supremacy at the very moment of its peak relative power. The fatal flaw was embedded in its design. To supply the world with reserves, America had to run deficits. But those very deficits would eventually erode confidence in the dollar's gold peg. By the late 1950s, a brilliant Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin identified the system's profound, inescapable contradiction, now known as the Triffin Dilemma. He testified before the U.S. Congress with a warning that was both simple and apocalyptic. The world's demand for dollar reserves was insatiable. As global trade expanded, countries needed more and more dollars to stabilize their exchange rates and facilitate transactions. The only supplier of these essential dollars was the United States, via its balance of payments deficit. Here was the dilemma. If the U.S. stopped running deficits and balanced its accounts, it would starve the world of dollar liquidity, triggering a global recession and a collapse of trade, a replay of the 1930s. But if the U.S. continued to supply dollars by running persistent deficits, sending more dollars abroad than it took in, the sheer volume of overseas dollar liabilities would inevitably exceed the U.S. gold stock that backed them. This would destroy confidence in the dollar's convertibility. The system required the U.S. to act against its own long-term credibility to serve the world's short-term needs. It was a mathematical time bomb. The U.S. was caught between its international responsibility as the system's liquidity provider and its national commitment to redeem dollars for gold. By the early 1960s, the warning signs flashed. U.S. gold reserves, which stood at over $20 billion in 1950, began a steady decline as countries like France started to exchange their surplus dollars for tangible gold. The gold window at the New York Fed was the system's pressure release valve, and the pressure was building. Policymakers tried bizarre, stopgap measures to defend the $35 peg, like the London Gold Pool, where Western central banks jointly sold gold on the open market to suppress the price. But these were fingers in a cracking dam. Triffin had prophesied a no-win scenario. The system would choke on a lack of dollars or drown in an excess of them. The world was choosing the latter path, flooding Europe with dollars that began to question their own golden promise. Before the Triffin Dilemma could play out, the United States proactively pumped dollars into the global system on an unprecedented scale. The 1948 European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan, was geopolitically framed as a generous shield against Soviet communism. Economically, it was the essential priming of the Bretton Woods pump. The U.S. provided over $13 billion, roughly $150 billion today, in grants and loans to Western Europe. This capital was not a gift, it was strategic liquidity. It allowed Europe to purchase American machinery, food, and fuel, funding its own reconstruction while ensuring those dollars cycled back into the U.S. economy. The Marshall Plan created a dollar-denominated recovery, cementing the currency's role. But an unintended, colossal consequence emerged: the Eurodollar market. With the Soviet Union fearing its dollar assets could be frozen by the U.S., it deposited them in European banks, notably in London. These were Eurodollars, U.S. dollar deposits held outside the United States, free from Federal Reserve regulation, reserve requirements, and interest rate caps. The market exploded. By the mid-1960s, it was a massive, unregulated shadow banking system. Eurodollars multiplied the system's fragility. They represented a claim on U.S. gold, but they existed beyond American control. Any foreign holder of a Eurodollar could theoretically ask for gold conversion, but the chain of custody was opaque. More critically, this offshore pool allowed for a staggering credit creation. European banks could lend these dollars relentlessly, creating a multiplier effect that swamped the global economy with dollar liquidity that the U.S. hadn't officially printed. The world was now awash in dollars from two sources: the official U.S. deficits and the unchecked credit creation of the offshore Eurodollar market. The fixed link to gold at $35 an ounce was becoming a transparent fiction, sustained only by faith and geopolitical muscle. The foundation of Bretton Woods was not just cracking, it was being eroded by a tidal wave of its own creation. In 1965, the theoretical flaw identified by Triffin became a geopolitical confrontation. President Charles de Gaulle of France, a staunch nationalist, launched a direct attack on American financial hegemony. He viewed the exorbitant privilege as an unfair subsidy that allowed the U.S. to finance global military dominance and corporate acquisitions abroad simply by running the printing press. In a now legendary press conference, de Gaulle, flanked by his economic advisor Jacques Rueff, declared the gold exchange standard absurd and called for a return to the classical gold standard. Then he backed his words with action. France began systematically exchanging its entire surplus dollar holdings for physical gold, dispatching naval vessels to New York to transport the bars back to the Banque de France. This was not a mere economic policy. It was a declaration of financial war, a deliberate move to expose the emperor's lack of clothes. De Gaulle's rationale was brutally logical. If the system was based on gold convertibility, then France would take the gold, forcing discipline upon the profligate issuer. The American response was a mixture of panic and pressure. U.S. officials, from Treasury secretaries to presidents, pleaded with and threatened allies not to follow France's lead. The run on gold accelerated. U.S. gold reserves plummeted from a post-war high to dangerous levels. To defend the $35 peg, the U.S. and Europe formed the London Gold Pool in 1961, agreeing to sell gold from their collective reserves to suppress the free market price. It was a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion that paper dollars and gold were still perfect substitutes. The pool worked for a time, but de Gaulle's assault broke its back. By 1967, with speculative pressure mounting, France withdrew from the pool. The market sensed blood. In 1968, a two-tier gold market was created, an official $35 rate for central banks, and a free-floating market price for everyone else. The dam had broken. The world now had two prices for gold, publicly acknowledging that the dollar was overvalued. De Gaulle had proven that the system relied not on rules, but on the forbearance of other nations. That forbearance was now exhausted. While external pressure mounted from France, internal American policy delivered the knockout blow. President Lyndon B. Johnson, committed to building his Great Society at home while waging war in Vietnam, faced a brutal economic choice: raise taxes to pay for these massive expenditures, or finance them through deficit spending. He chose the latter. The era of guns and butter unleashed a torrent of fiscal stimulus that the U.S. economy could not absorb without inflation. The U.S. government ran large budget deficits, paid for by the Federal Reserve's accommodating monetary policy. This flooded the domestic economy with money, driving up prices. As U.S. inflation rose, the fixed $35 per ounce gold peg became increasingly unsustainable. Gold, a classic inflation hedge, became undervalued. Savvy investors and foreign central banks had even more incentive to trade their depreciating dollars for stable gold. Furthermore, the war-driven U.S. trade surplus evaporated. By the late 1960s, America was running a balance of payments deficit, meaning more dollars were flowing out to pay for imports and military ventures than were flowing in. This created the perfect storm: a fiscal deficit driving inflation, a balance of payments deficit flooding the world with dollars, and a fixed gold price that made those dollars look increasingly overvalued. The Triffin Dilemma was no longer academic. It was manifesting in real time. America was supplying the world with liquidity, but that liquidity was now inflationary and suspect. The link between the dollar and gold, the linchpin of the entire Bretton Woods system, was now held together by little more than diplomatic precedent and fear of the unknown alternative. The cost of the Vietnam War was measured not just in lives, but in the final erosion of the financial discipline required to maintain global monetary order. The system was living on borrowed time, and the lender of last resort, global confidence, was calling in its loan. By the summer of 1971, the crisis was untenable. Speculators launched a massive assault, betting billions that the dollar would be devalued. America's gold reserves had fallen to about $10 billion, while foreign dollar claims stood at over $50 billion. The run was on. On Friday, August 13th, President Richard Nixon convened a secret meeting at Camp David with his top economic advisors, including Treasury Secretary John Connally. The options were stark: defend the dollar with draconian deflationary policies, devalue it officially, or sever the link to gold entirely. Connally, the archetypal political hardball player, advocated for the most dramatic option: unilateral closure of the gold window. On Sunday, August 15th, Nixon addressed the nation in a televised speech that shook the foundations of global finance. Announcing a new economic policy, he imposed a 90-day wage and price freeze, a 10% surcharge on imports, and most catastrophically for Bretton Woods, he temporarily suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The world listened in stunned silence. The cornerstone of the post-war financial order, the promise that made the dollar the trusted reserve, was ripped out in a single night. There was no consultation with allies. The move was a raw assertion of national power over international obligation. The temporary suspension was permanent. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Global currency markets closed for a week. When they reopened, the world of fixed parities was dead. The Smithsonian Agreement in December 1971 attempted a patch, devaluing the dollar to $38 per ounce, but it was a lifeless facade. By 1973, the last attempts to maintain fixed rates were abandoned, and the world lurched into the era of floating exchange rates. The Nixon Shock was not merely the end of Bretton Woods. It was the moment the United States, faced with the bill for its own privilege, chose to default on its foundational promise. The betrayal was now complete. The system designed to prevent competitive devaluations had ended with the most consequential unilateral devaluation in history, executed by its chief beneficiary. The collapse of Bretton Woods did not dethrone the dollar. It liberated it from its last constraint. Freed from the obligation to redeem dollars for gold, the U.S. could now run deficits without any external check. The world moved into an experimental era of floating exchange rates, where currency values were set by the volatile forex market of supply and demand. This new non-system had immediate consequences. Exchange rate volatility became a major new risk for international businesses, giving rise to a vast new industry in currency hedging and financial derivatives. More profoundly, it ushered in the pure fiat money era. Currencies were no longer backed by any physical commodity, but solely by the trust in the government that issued them and the economic power it represented. The dollar, with its deep markets, political stability, and entrenched role, remained the dominant fiat currency by default. The exorbitant privilege evolved. America could now create inflation and export it globally through a depreciating dollar, without facing a run on its gold. The 1970s became a decade of stagflation. High inflation combined with stagnant growth, as the oil price shocks of 1973 and 1979 collided with this new monetary instability. The lack of a nominal anchor led central banks to lose control of price expectations. The discipline that gold had imposed, however flawed, was gone. In its place was a world where monetary policy was an exercise in managing confidence without a rulebook. The dollar was still king, but it was now a king without a crown, ruling through inertia and the lack of a credible challenger in a chaotic, floating realm. The 1973 oil crisis, where OPEC embargoed the West and quadrupled oil prices, presented a mortal threat to the dollar's dominance. OPEC nations were suddenly flooded with massive dollar surpluses, petrodollars. A critical deal was struck, primarily with Saudi Arabia in 1974. The U.S. offered military protection and arms sales. In return, Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, invest its surplus petrodollar revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds, and other American assets. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, an unwritten but powerful successor to Bretton Woods. It created a self-reinforcing loop. To buy oil, every country needed dollars. This sustained global demand for dollars regardless of U.S. economic policy. The petrodollar surpluses recycled back to Wall Street, financing U.S. deficits and keeping American interest rates lower than they otherwise would be. It transformed oil from a mere commodity into the de facto backing of the dollar. Any country that threatened to price oil in another currency, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, faced severe geopolitical consequences. The petrodollar pact solved the dollar's post-gold problem by tethering it to the most essential global commodity. It ensured the dollar's reserve status was no longer based on a promise of gold, but on a necessity for energy. This system entrenched American financial power even more deeply than Bretton Woods had, because it was backed by tangible, immediate need rather than a theoretical metallic promise. By the late 1970s, the floating fiat era's chaos culminated in runaway U.S. inflation nearing 15%. The dollar was in crisis, threatening its very role as a store of value. In 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker took radical, brutal action. He dramatically raised the federal funds rate, pushing it to a peak of 20% by 1981. The Volcker shock induced a severe recession but strangled inflation. Its global impact was tectonic. Sky-high U.S. interest rates acted as a magnet for global capital, causing the dollar to soar. For the developing world, it was a catastrophe. They had borrowed heavily in dollars during the low-rate 1970s. Now, their debt servicing costs exploded as their own currencies collapsed against the dollar. This triggered the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. Volcker's policy was a stark demonstration of raw monetary sovereignty. The U.S., to solve its domestic inflation problem, could export financial devastation worldwide through the dollar's interest rate and exchange rate channels. The world was powerless. They were tied to the dollar standard, subject to the domestic policy whims of the Federal Reserve. The shock reestablished the dollar's credibility as a hard currency, but it did so by proving that the costs of dollar hegemony were now borne externally through waves of debt and currency crises in the periphery. The debt crises of the 1980s provided the opportunity to institutionalize dollar dominance through policy doctrine. The Washington Consensus, a set of 10 market-oriented policy prescriptions promoted by the U.S. Treasury, IMF, and World Bank, became the condition for bailouts and assistance. It demanded privatization, deregulation, trade liberalization, and importantly, capital account liberalization, the free flow of money across borders. This forced developing nations to open their financial markets to volatile dollar-based capital. It deepened the global footprint of Wall Street and made economies more susceptible to dollar liquidity cycles. The IMF, a Bretton Woods institution, evolved from a manager of fixed exchange rates into the world's financial crisis manager and enforcer of this dollar-centric neoliberal order. Countries in crisis were forced into austerity to protect the value of foreign, often dollar-denominated debt. The system ensured that the burdens of adjustment always fell on the deficit countries of the Global South, never on the issuer of the reserve currency. The Bretton Woods ideals of cooperation had morphed into a rigid framework for maintaining the dollar's structural advantage and enforcing economic policies favorable to Western, particularly American, financial interests. The dangers of the post-Bretton Woods order were showcased in the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Tiger economies like Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia had attracted huge inflows of hot dollar-denominated capital during the early 1990s, lured by high growth and Washington consensus policies. This capital built speculative bubbles. When the U.S. Federal Reserve began raising interest rates in 1994, the flow reversed. Global dollar liquidity tightened. Investors fled, dumping Asian currencies. Countries with fixed or managed exchange rates, a legacy desire for Bretton Woods-like stability, saw their dollar reserves evaporate in failed defense attempts. They were forced to devalue catastrophically, while dollar-denominated debts became impossible to repay. The IMF intervened with harsh, pro-cyclical conditions that exacerbated recessions. The crisis revealed the brutal asymmetry. The U.S. central bank, setting policy for domestic goals, could unleash tidal waves of capital that destabilized emerging markets. These nations were trapped. If they pegged to the dollar, they imported American monetary policy. If they floated, they were exposed to volatile capital flows. The system provided the dollar's liquidity, but none of its stability to those on the periphery. The crisis was a direct result of a world financially structured around a single, domestically focused currency, without any global stabilizing mechanism. The global financial crisis of 2008 originated in U.S. subprime mortgages, but became a worldwide dollar crisis. As Lehman Brothers fell, global dollar funding markets froze. Banks and corporations outside the U.S. desperately needed dollars to service their debts, but couldn't access them. In a dramatic move, the Federal Reserve became the world's central bank, establishing swap lines with other major central banks to provide unlimited dollar liquidity. This Fed put saved the global system but underscored total dependence. Then came quantitative easing, QE. The Fed created trillions of new dollars to buy bonds, pushing down U.S. interest rates. This tidal wave of cheap dollars flooded into emerging markets, searching for yield and inflating asset bubbles from Brazil to Indonesia. When the Fed merely hinted at tapering QE in 2013, it caused the taper tantrum, sparking capital flight and currency collapses in vulnerable economies. The cycle repeated. U.S. policy caused a crisis, the Fed provided dollar relief on its own terms, and its recovery measures created destabilizing spillovers. The exorbitant privilege had become the exorbitant duty and the exorbitant destabilizer. The world was hostage to the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, a stark testament to a system with no true international lender of last resort, only a national one with global reach. Today, the tensions of the Bretton Woods betrayal reach a new peak. Nations chafe under financial weaponization. The use of dollar clearance systems, SWIFT, and reserves freezing as tools of geopolitical coercion, as seen against Russia. This has triggered active de-dollarization efforts. China promotes yuan settlement in commodities and bilateral swaps. BRICS nations discuss alternative payment systems. Gold purchases by central banks, especially China, Russia, India, hit multi-decade highs, echoing de Gaulle's distrust. Yet, the dollar's dominance endures due to network effects and a lack of alternatives. The U.S. still offers deep, liquid capital markets and the rule of law. The euro has existential questions. The yuan faces capital controls. and no other currency combines scale, stability, and openness. The petrodollar, while fragmenting, persists. We live in a paradoxical, multipolar world with a unipolar currency. The legacy of Bretton Woods is this entrenched path dependency. The system designed in 1944 created a gravitational pull so strong that escaping it requires a coordinated, catastrophic loss of faith or a viable alternative ecosystem, neither of which yet exists. The betrayal was not just the suspension of gold convertibility, but the creation of a hierarchy that normalized global dependence on the domestic political and economic priorities of a single nation. We are all, still, living inside the architecture of that New Hampshire hotel, trading in the shadows of a broken promise, navigating a world order whose foundational flaw was written into its blueprint. The question is no longer if the system is fair, but how long inertia can hold against the gathering forces seeking to settle the final bill. The Bretton Woods Agreement wasn't a failure. It was a spectacular, deliberate success for American power, operating exactly as its key architects intended, until the costs of maintaining the illusion became too high. The system's betrayal was not an accident. It was the inevitable outcome of granting one nation a financial privilege it could not responsibly wield. The world is still searching for an escape from that trap. If you want to understand the next potential escape route, the rise of digital currencies, the geopolitics of gold, and the real endgame for dollar dominance, you need to understand what comes after hegemony. That story is next on Financial Relic.